What's going on, everyone? So in today's tutorial, I'm going to be walking you through my process for creating your own custom surface imperfection textures for your 3D materials. So right off the bat, what is a surface imperfection? Well, I can find surface imperfections right here on my microphone. I can find them on my phone. I can find them on my car. They are any of the fingerprints, smudges, scratches, basically any visible wear and tear that you would find on a physical object here in the world. That's a surface imperfection. And when we're thinking about our 3D materials, what that does by embedding those in, it just increases the realism of our renders. And so for myself, always want to be a better 3D artist. I knew that I had to do better in this category, and so I decided to create my own. So I embarked on trying to figure out this process of how best to go about it. I think I pretty much have it dialed in. I've been really happy with the results, and so I figured that I would share this process with you guys. Lastly, for any of you all watching today's video, let's say you're interested in surface imperfections, but you really don't care about participating in art class today. I'm actually going to be releasing all of the initial textures that I created in a volume 1 pack. The link is going to be right down below in the video description. These have been lifesavers. I love them. This volume 1 pack is going to include 20 4K seamless handmade 16-bit textures. Can't recommend these enough, so be sure to give them a check out if you're interested. All right, so first step in this process, what I would recommend doing is take a beat, sit down with a pen and paper, and try to figure out a little bit of a game plan for what textures are important to you that you want to capture. So for instance, with myself, I basically had 3 surfaces that I was interested in. So the first was going to be like touchable screens, so phones, tablets. I also wanted to get like general floor debris. And then the third one was just going to be any outdoor items that had like super heavy wear and tear. So all 3 of those, again, you're looking at those fingers, those smudges, hairs, dust, water damage, all of that basically encompass kind of those 3 areas that I was looking to capture these textures. All right, so now that you have your general list figured out, the next thing that you're going to want to determine is what's your highest megapixel camera on hand. For myself, I ended up using my Sony a7S III, which is what I'm shooting this video on right now. But basically with this camera, it allowed me to do 3 things. I could shoot at 4K, I could shoot uncompressed and in RAW format. Those were super important to me because I wanted to basically capture as much color and light information as I could for each of these photos for when I'm editing them in Photoshop and post. But if you're out there and you don't have a mirrorless or a DSLR camera, don't sweat it. Just grab your phone. I mean, these things are amazing. The cameras are fucking top notch on them anymore. The one recommendation that I would say if you're going to try to capture these with your iPhone is go into your camera settings and turn on Pro RAW. Pro RAW is ostensibly, it's going to, again, capture the most dynamic range information within your photos. So then again, when we're in Photoshop later, you've just got more information, more color information, more lighting information to kind of work with when you're doing your edits. All right, so you've got your camera picked out. Now let's kind of talk about some camera and shooting techniques that I found really worked for this process. So the first thing across the board is we want to eliminate all depth of field. So newer iPhones, any DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, if you got an f-stop setting, crank that thing to the moon. You basically want a very small aperture, which should eliminate any sort of depth of field in your photographs, right? Then, depending on how you're shooting these, let's say if you're using a tripod or if you're just out there just holding the camera handheld, for tripod shooting, I actually would recommend setting a little bit of a timer. Again, you think about when you're grabbing the camera body, clicking to take that photo. If you happen to move the camera a little bit, if you set anything between like a 2 to 5 second timer, hopefully any sort of motion blur should be eliminated by that point. And then if you're out handheld just shooting these things, crank your shutter speed. You want these to be super quick. Again, if you have a long exposure, you're going to get motion within the photo. So crank that shutter speed, and you should be great. All right, so now that we have our list figured out for the textures we want to capture, the camera we're going to use, and we have some general rules of thumb for shooting techniques, let's talk about how to capture these different surface imperfections. With fingerprints, what I found worked best is to head on down to your local arts and crafts store, or hell, even your grocery, and pick up some poster board and some paint or ink. All you do is you're going to apply that paint or ink to your fingertips and press away. The key here is you want variation in the fingerprint opacity of the ink. So basically apply it once, just keep pressing until literally that ink or paint runs out on your fingertips, right? You're going to have all sorts of subtle inconsistencies in the visibility of those fingerprints on your poster board, which is what we want, right? That's how these would be in real life. You'd have some fingerprints that are fresh, you'd have other ones that have been there for a while and are starting to wear away. So this is the best recommendation I can give for fingerprints. And then if you want to get crazy and expand past just fingerprints, well, lather up your entire hand, man, and press away on that poster board. Same rule of thumb for this. Go for inconsistencies. Go for different directions. It'll really create more realism than in these textures. So talking about dust, there's actually two techniques that I found that worked really well for me. So the first one is, again, going back to poster board, but let's go with a black piece of poster board as opposed to white, and just getting baking powder, right? What you could do is you just sprinkle that powder all over the poster board. If you want to go for more of a minimal look, just sprinkle a little bit. If you really want to dump some on there, and then you can kind of run your hands a little bit through there to get some cool kind of like waves of motion. It just depends on the look that you're going for. But I found that this first technique worked really well. In terms of a second technique for capturing dust, jump over to your dryer in your home, pull out your lint trap and grab all that dryer lint that's been collected in there. I actually would just take a ball of that, start to just kind of try to sprinkle that across that poster board. Worked phenomenal. You get all sorts of little dust particles, even little hairs that'll kind of pop out from time to time just to create, again, like some different inconsistencies and different variables of like visual dust and debris that you can then capture with your photo. Now, for hairs, I unfortunately have an unfair advantage compared to you all, probably. So I have an 8-year-old Siberian Husky who sheds more than any other animal here on planet Earth. So all I have to do is basically go over and pet her or look down on any of my floors and there's white hair. So I would collect that, take a piece of black poster board, again, sprinkle all of that around here. It was fantastic. The other option that I did is, again, this may be a little bit of a, how comfortable you feel with this, but I cut my own hair. And so I just did a little bit of a trim up. I kept all of those hairs that I had done, and whether if it's from your hair, your beard, I mean, whatever. Let's keep it up top, and easy as that, right? The biggest thing you just want to remember is, depending on the color of hair, is you want to have a backing that has the most contrast. So for me, darker hair, white poster board. For my dog's hair, it was white, so I went with dark poster board. It's as simple as that. Okay, so the last textures that I ended up capturing here in my studio was finger smudges. Now, I originally thought that I could still just apply paint to my fingers and maybe run my fingers across, the poster board, but the reality is I wasn't, again, getting these lifelike results. There wasn't a ton of variation in the contrast and the opacity that I was desiring, so I actually just decided to grab an iPad that I had laying around here and use that. So the tricky thing really came because my iPad screen, it's pretty reflectant, right? So if I have lights that are, trying to light up basically that surface so that I can capture this photo, how do I avoid the reflections of the lights on the screen? Well, I have a buddy who does product photography, and he kind of gave me this general idea of how to create a little lighting setup to help diffuse that. So the first step was, of course, grabbing the iPad, wiped that thing off, cleaned it off very nice, and then smudged it up. What I did find that really helped with creating the smudges was run your fingertips through your hair, or even just like blow, warm air into your palms. The oil and the heat really helped with kind of solidifying smudges on the screen. So once I had the iPad kind of smudged up and set to go, the rig that I built was basically putting the iPad directly below my camera that was on a tripod, And then I took a piece of that black poster board and basically created a barrier in between where the iPad was. And then I had two lights right behind that poster board. So the light was still creeping up under the poster board, but it wasn't able to directly hit the screen, which eliminated all of the lighting reflections that I didn't want to have in my photos. So if you're able to, kind of do this as well as home, which I feel like most of you guys can. I mean, you can see like my setup is not professional by any means, but it worked out great for me. And when capturing textures outside, again, the biggest recommendation I can give is have a very quick shutter speed. You'll, of course, want to adjust your ISO and aperture to fit accordingly what you need, but shutter speed is the name of the game. Objects that I found that worked really well, if you have trash cans, tires, anything that's non-reflectant, but you also, from the object versus the textures on there, you have enough contrast between those two. Those are going to work the best. All right, so we've now taken all of our photos, but how do we go about taking our photos and turning them into surface imperfection textures? Well, we need to first download all the photos onto our computer and then open up Photoshop. Okay, so let's pop over to Photoshop. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna jump over here to Open, and let's find this image that we just brought in or downloaded to our computer. So initially, since again, I shot raw, Photoshop, you're not gonna open into your default canvas. You actually open up into this camera raw sort of UI that allows you to figure out, do you wanna do any pre-editing with the information that you captured in your photo? So there's two pieces of advice that I would give to you guys. The first one being, if we go over here and we look at the profile, I like to set this to Adobe Neutral. All of these other options, they start to kind of like make adjustments to the information that's included within your photo. I feel like a little bit too prematurely. If you don't see this option, you just come down here to browse and you should see it right here as an item to choose. So we'll click the back button. We have Adobe Neutral. The other one, which is already open, is the optics menu. So on some of these photos, when you're looking around, you may start to notice a little bit of vignetting depending on like what your lighting setup was. This is super helpful for kind of eliminating that. So depending on if it's too light or too dark, you can kind of set the vignette at whatever strength you want. I actually want to darken this just a little bit, and then the midpoint you can kind of set, which you can see very subtly. It's adjusting the light coming in. So I'm going to drag this back just a little bit right there. If we give a quick once over on the photo, I'm pretty happy with this. So I'm going to go ahead and click Open. And now we are into the traditional Photoshop canvas, right? So let's go ahead and click on our background layer. We want to make this editable. So the first thing we want to do, we always want to be working within black and white and gray values for creating these textures. The way to think about this is in your 3D materials, anything that's white, 100% white, is going to be the highest value of a surface imperfection. So the highest, scratch or finger smudge or handprint. But anything that's black is going to be 100% reflectant, right? Again, we think about our roughness. These is roughness maps for our reflectance channels within our materials. So depending on the photo that you took, let's say that if the dirt or the hair is actually black against a white background, you want to invert these. Luckily for our purposes, this is all white kind of dust and hairs against my iPad screen, which is black, so we don't need to invert this. But we do want to just add a black and white adjustment layer just to make sure we're only dealing with those black and white and gray values. So we add this adjustment layer. And really the crux of creating these is going to be with levels adjustments. So I'm going to create a level adjustment layer. And what I want to do is I just want to crunch these whites. I'm going to bring these whites in a little bit. And you can see on our image how everything kind of lightens up. And I'm just crunch these blacks just a little bit. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this right now. Like a lot of these little dust particles and stuff down here, you've got some, nice kind of contrast between them, but there's still some super subtle little, gray areas popping through, which again, variation, we want variation. You do probably notice over here in the top right, we're seeing some of these like existing smudges that were still on the screen. Now, for my purposes, I don't think completely removing these is necessary. I like having that variation. But if you would prefer to remove those, and again, let's just say we just want to capture dust and hair for this one, little trick, add a second level adjustment layer. So we're going to add a second level adjustment layer. And then what we're going to do is we're going to crunch these blacks while looking at that top right portion. And that looks pretty good, right? We've just removed all of those fingerprint smudges. But if we turn this off, if we look over on the left-hand side, there's still like little gray areas with our dust that I kind of like to bring back in just to create that subtle variation. Like you see these little spots down here. So how do we go about doing this? Well, with our layer mask. So the layer mask that's already applied to this level adjustments layer, if we click on that and then just hit E on your keyboard for your eraser, I'm just going to set a brush size that's, you know, kind of, let's say, medium to small. Main thing is make sure that there is zero hardness on your brush. We want this down to 0. And set it to a very low opacity. I'm just going to do 10%. But what we now can do, since we're on that layer mask, is we can start to paint out this mask a little bit. And so I'm just kind of clicking around these areas that I know I don't want as much of this mask. Maybe I'll up the opacity just a little bit so it doesn't take me quite as much time. But again, there's really no right or wrong. This is a very subjective thing to be doing, but we're just kind of painting some of this out. To kind of see if this is working, we can turn this mask off and then turn it on, and we can kind of see, especially over here, we're getting some of those areas back in that we wanted. So I'm just going to kind of keep painting this, paint this out. Okay, I think this is pretty good, actually. I'm pretty happy with this. So again, we'll turn this off. We can see all that smudges and kind of smears were existing. We turn this back on, and they've been pretty much removed, right? So get to a point, we're happy with this guy, let's move forward. So what I would do is I'm going to take this initial layer and all these adjustment layers, and I'm just going to group them. So Control G on your keyboard. And then what we need to do is we need to come up here to our image, and canvas size. So we have a 4K image. It is at 16-bit. We've already kind of set those parameters up in our camera, but our canvas width is we need a 1:1 aspect ratio for this to tile and be seamless. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to set this to 4096 by 4096, right? Going ahead and hit proceed. Now we have a canvas that is a 1:1, but we obviously, our image does not fit this appropriately. So what I would do is just Control A and then align to the top for that group. So we have that initial group aligned up here, but we need to fill this in. So I'm just going to Control J, which duplicates that group. And then what I'm going to do is drag this all the way down to the bottom. So now our canvas is completely covered. But it's literally just the exact image dragged down the bottom. So just to create a little bit of variation, I'm going to go up here to Edit, Transform, and I'm going to flip this on the horizontal axis, right? So at least there's a little bit of difference in how these images are aligning. So we now have this image completely covered, which is what we wanted. The problem is, though, is you can still see this very distinct line between the top group and the bottom group. So we need to get rid of that. So how do we do that? Layer mask, that's all we need. So if we come down here, we're going to add a layer mask to that second group that we created. And again, just hit E on your keyboard. Get a brush, kind of a larger brush. Again, we're going to go for a low opacity, so around 20%. And then, again, just start to paint out these areas that we don't want so that they look a little bit more like this is one image. It's all blended. So I'm just going to kind of go through here, just keep painting, again, no right or wrong for this. You just need to kind of get to a spot that you feel like this looks like one complete image and not two images grouped on top of each other, which is what we don't want. So we're still painting. I think probably right around here. Let's bring in, a little bit too far, so we can just reverse our color. Nope, that's not what we want. And go to the high opacity, paint that back in. Okay. So let's do this again. We're just going to kind of come down here, paint. Okay. Okay, I think this looks pretty darn good. If we zoom out and we look at this image, I think it looks great, right? So we're going to go on ahead and use this as our main image. So what we need to do is we're just going to grab both of these groups now, group them once more, Control J to make a copy of this, and then you want to hit Control E on your keyboard to rasterize that second parent group. So now we have this as one single image, which we're going to use. Now to make sure that this is cropped again, because that original image size was a little bit wider than our 4096, is just your keyboard, hit Control A to select all, and then come up to Image, and we want to hit Crop. So now this image should be cropped, which is exactly what we want for creating seamless textures. But the problem is, if we notice, so let's just drag this over, and I'm going to duplicate this layer, so Control J. And if we align these next to each other, you notice that these are not seamless at all. You can very much see this direct line of these two images connecting. So how do we go about making these seamless? Well, let's go ahead and just Control Z to undo, undo, undo. So the way that we go about doing this is we're going to use an offset filter. So if we come up to Filter in Photoshop and go over to Offset, what offset does is you basically supply two values for the horizontal and the vertical axis, and it will offset that image by whatever the pixel density is that you put as the offset. So for us, we have a 4096 by 4096 canvas, which is our image. So we just want to divide that by 2, which would be 2048. So we already have those actually put into the input field. So 2048 by 2048. Let's hit OK. It's for the most part created 4 separate images that are all aligned. So how do we make these seamless now? Well, we need to go through, and what I have found has worked is use your clone stamp tool. So I'm going to come over here and choose my clone stamp tool. Again, set a brush size. It's kind of small to medium. We want a very low opacity. So I'll actually, from 10, I'll go to 15. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to try to clone and paint out these seams, right? So what I would do is if I notice one right down here, maybe I want to grab a little bit of the debris down at the bottom there, and I'm just going to click and kind of paint, right? There's no right or wrong with this. This is just you finding areas of your photo that you think that you can paint in to kind of mask out these lines. So we're going to go through here and paint all of these out. All right, so I'm actually pretty happy with this. So again, if we look at kind of those 4 quadrants, I can't find any distinct lines to distinguish them. So I like this, but we need to test this out. So really the next step of this process, let's go on ahead and move this image over to the side, and let's Control J to duplicate it. If we drag out another copy and we align this, we zoom in, looks pretty dang seamless to me, right? Let's go on ahead and just duplicate both of these again and drag these up to test the top. Locked in place. It looks great. I looking at these, I cannot see any seams, and then I can just kind of move this freely along my canvas, and this just all looks like one seamless texture, which I'm super happy with. So we'll delete the 3 copies we made. We'll just Control A to select all, realign that initial image, and we're done. If you want, you now have this finished image. You can always apply a last-minute levels adjustment if you want. If, let's say, you just want to up some of the whites, or you want to bring some of the blacks down, or mess with the midpoint on this, we're not going to worry about it. But again, you have the option. This is where you can kind of choose and be creative. But last thing we really need to do is to save out a TIFF. TIFF is going to be your file, your preferred file extension. So just go to File, Save As. We'll choose TIFF. We'll save this to our desktop and call it dus_01. Yep, we'll replace because I already had one there from earlier. Okay, so now that we've created a surface imperfection texture, I wanted to quickly show you guys how you can bring this into your 3D editing software, and you can use it to drive your roughness maps to kind of affect the reflections, right, of your materials. So we've opened up Cinema 4D, and we have Redshift. We're a Redshift family for Render Viewer. But as you can see over in the layers panel, so this is very simple. We just have a sphere. We have this basic material applied to it. We have a dome light in here that's just providing some kind of subtle background lights and shadows. I've got 2 area lights here in my scene that you can see. And then I'm just using a second dome light just for a white background, right? But as we notice here in the Redshift Render Viewer, these 2 area lights, the reflections on these lights are super crisp, right? Like we know that they're squares, rectangles. You can kind of see them in the distance. There's also like some subtle reflections from our HDRI. But if we wanted to add some surface imperfections to drive that roughness map, how do we do that? So open up our material in our node editor. So the nodes that we've got, we basically have a texture node, we have a ramp node, and then there's the material itself being output to our object surface. So all we need to do is click on our texture node. And if you don't have this, obviously, when you first open up your material, double click anywhere in the node editor. You can type texture and it'll give you a shortcut to that node. But all we need to do then is the attributes panel over here as we click on the path. And I'm going to use one of the materials from my pack. So Scratches 01. Let's bring this in. Then we're just going to pipe this into our ramp. And then our ramp is going to go right into our reflections roughness. Now, as soon as we did that, you look over here in the render viewer, automatically we're getting some surface imperfections on this reflections, right? This actually looks super cool. This looks like the sphere has like seen better days, right? Just the realism of the object in the space is a million times better. The one thing that you can kind of always do is this ramp node is kind of an in-between guide that if, let's say that, you're like, well, actually I kind of want to crunch my blacks a little bit more to, again, get rid of some of that. So again, if we zoom in, you can still see there's like some subtle little imperfections, but it's much more reflectant, the material. We're just going to bring that all the way back to not position 0, but that's it really at like a base level for how you can use these within your materials to drive your roughness channels for your reflections. Okay, so that was that. You guys just created your very own surface imperfection texture, right? Super easy. I hope that you guys feel inspired to kind of go out there and make some of these on your own. Like I mentioned earlier, though, if this is not really your jam and you're not a big fan of the arts and crafts, I am selling this volume 1 pack, this first pack that I created. 20 textures. They're all seamless, 4K, 16-bit. And within this pack, I actually include tutorials on showing you guys how I use these in my materials. So not only looking at roughness maps, but bump maps. I'll use these to create wear and tear on like surface decals. There's a lot of valuable information that I include in here for the price. Also with ZBrush, I bring these into ZBrush all the time and can use these to sculpt geometry onto my models. I'm telling you, it's well worth it if you're interested in it. But anyhow, if you guys happen to have any questions, pop them right down into the comments and you take care.